nominated to serve as the FCC by President Trump. He was confirmed by the United States in 2020. He brings both private and public sector experience. He previously served as a senior advisor to the NTIA. Very important. In his role, he worked on many aspects of telecommunications policy, including spectrum, allocation and planning, broadband access. The U.S. government's role in the area. Prior to joining the commission, he was senior counsel to Brightstar Corporation and International Mobile Device Services. He led and negotiated in that capacity agreements on telecommunications equipment and services and transactions in over 20 countries. Prior to joining Brightstar, he worked as an attorney in private practice. Commissioner Simington is a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School. He also holds degrees from the University of Rochester and Lawrence University. Commissioner Simington grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada. He became a United States citizen, now lives in Plain, Virginia. Let me welcome him, Commissioner. The University of Michigan finally be Ohio State.
My immediate life is Ohio State grad, so I will tell you what conversations transpired next.
Every time an underdog beats incumbent on the market, we kind of start. Well, thank you for being with us. You've been at the FCC a little over a year. Take a moment and talk about your work.
Oh, shit. I think we need this in 2021. It's very funny. Every time we reach here, they tend to be forward-looking. I think that's appropriate speaking to those here today. And so I'd like to highlight three that I think first of all, orbital debris. Orbital debris is really on the agenda.
What's that? No, we have separate. Can you fix it internally?
And yet, you are hoping because you need is at a good level of technology management. We deal with consistent, which is very challenging. I don't know if you've probably a lot of you folks have seen pictures of exactly what happens when a screw moving at orbital velocities happens to contact the satellite, and the satellite's essentially blown apart. So continuing debris tracking and mitigation measures are something that we need to encourage. And then there's a larger concept associated with this. We want to make the United States a jurisdiction of choice for satellite operators. And there are both incentives, positive incentives and negative incentives. First of all, we've got the ability to ask what the price is for access to the US market. And I don't mean a dollars and cents price, but in terms of positive and pro-social behaviors that promote the continued use and viability of the space economy. But then I also mean, what are the benefits that we can bring by being forward-thinking in regulation? For example, what if we think about what cost control really looks like and start finding ways to give companies credit, working with insurers, working with other people who have a stake in the space economy to incentivize continued development of the most advanced technologies in that area. So that's one area of focus. The second is receiver performance. Now, I'm careful to use the term, careful about using the term receiver standards. Whenever you say that, people start worrying that the FCC is going to become too prescriptive. I don't think, frankly, that the FCC is staffed to serve as the, as the receiver standards authority, and if anyone could be one, because the technical challenges of doing this are insurmountable. A transmitter, you can test that, in a room behind a curtain in a cardboard box. Not very difficult. Receivers, you have to take them out into the field, assess performance under a wide variety of conditions. So up until now, we've never really addressed the question. At the same time, we're increasingly seeing problems where established practices based on the installed base that's standard technology and that's vendor standard in a particular service or application winds up having a veto over new entrants, sometimes in quite distant bands. So I think there are some things we can do to address that. And then the third thing is physical layer security. Now, I want to be careful about that too. Cybersecurity makes it sound like the FCC wants to turn into DHS. And I don't think we do. I don't think a lot of other people would want us to do that either. But on the other hand, security at the physical layer has never been more to the point than it is now. And that is an area that is within our regulatory competence and that I don't really think is within anyone else's. So either we pick it up or someone's going to take it away from us at some point. And I think it behooves us to get it right and to think about the engineering on that.
Well, as you talked about orbital debris, one of our companies, Amazon, as you know, is preparing for a major deployment with Kuiper. As you talk about cybersecurity, Microsoft's really a leader in this space. And so we look forward to working with you on both of those issues. Another area that our members care very much about is spectrum policy. You've been very engaged and involved. Talk a little bit generally about the spectrum initiatives that are coming, and then I want to talk specifically about 12 gigahertz. But go ahead and let's start first with your broad view on spectrum.
Well, I think the agenda for the agency in 2022 in spectrum has already been well understood, and we've got to deliver on 2.5 gigahertz, and more generally, we've got to continue a policy of active development towards full power exclusive use, appropriately sized licenses in mid-band. Mid-band for 5G is really where all the action is right now. We've managed to free significant amounts of high band and low band. I'm not saying the work there is done, but mid-band is where we're facing the biggest crunch right now, and therefore it's where we need to work the hardest to free things up. This ties into the receiver quality issue as well, because we're going to have to face the question of how we start turning the lights on in full power exclusive use terrestrial wireless applications adjacent to services that have expectations that the bands next to them are going to be relatively quiet. And so I think it's important to get out in front of that right now as part of a larger question of getting more mid-band available. And just, to proselytize on mid-band for just a second, I feel like the general public sometimes doesn't fully understand the benefits of the 5G transition. They say, I already have 4G on my phone. It's pretty good. Everyone wants a newer phone, but I don't really see what the radical difference is. I would say there are two factors to that. First of all, with the full power of 4G didn't really become apparent until an app ecosystem emerged for it. And so consumer applications beyond merely accelerated and denser versions of existing 4G services are going to take time to emerge. But what we're seeing with 5G that's unique to 5G is the potential for very widely deployed industrial, public safety, and medical applications. I think that's really what the game changer is there. And the more the public comes to understand the necessity of 5G to continue development in those areas, then the more they'll support it. If it's just about a shinier phone, that's maybe less exciting at this point now that we're 15 years into the iPhone. But as far as the associated technologies, the potential, I might add, for following in the footsteps of the private networking approach that we've seen driven in some other countries. And that's providing a substrate for advanced software technologies like AI and machine learning to optimize production and maybe even have self-optimizing production in some cases, to automate the review of large volumes of medical records to distill non-obvious inferences from them. Things like this only become possible when you're operating at that kind of scale and efficiency. So if we want this to happen, we need the mid-band to happen, because that's how most Americans are going to truly experience transformative 5G and how we're going to have continued public buy-in.
As you talk about both mid-band and what 5G means, what's not discussed, I think, maybe enough, is the network, the race to the best network in the world, to the best 5G and fiber and all the fixed wireless and satellite deployments, low Earth orbiting. The 5G capacity is what enables the advanced applications. So autonomous vehicles, precision agriculture, telemedicine, telehealth, quantum computing, artificial intelligence. If we won 4G and when we began deploying our 4G networks, there were only, I think, 10 apps. Now we have millions. And it's hard to really go back and comprehend or imagine how significant that was to giving U.S. international leadership and really a dominant technology position in the world. We now have a rivalry with China that if we lose it, it impacts not only our global leadership, but it impacts our national security. So this gets us to our 12 gigahertz discussion. C-band just had a major issue and delay and problems because of encumbrances with other federal users. 12 gigahertz has no encumbrances, no interference from DOT or FAA or DOD or other federal users. It's the largest available mid-band block, 500 megahertz, and it can enable not only terrestrial commercial 5G competition and new innovation, new entrants like DISH and RS access, but fixed wireless in rural areas, opportunistic use and Wi-Fi and other innovative technologies. The record, we think, is pretty complete, and we have some great studies that have been submitted to the record that show that there's no harmful interference. Give us your thoughts on the proceeding and the way forward, and is this a good opportunity to not only lead in 5G, promote competition, but also have a band that does not have the problems many of the other bands have?
Now, that is an interesting question, because I'll say frankly, when I started hearing about the revival of terrestrial use in 12 gigahertz, my first question was, isn't coordination between satellite-based services and terrestrial services always problematic? Isn't that part of what got us into this mess that we've seen in coordination in a number of band repurposings and license amendments? So I was very surprised to see anyone proposing it, frankly. I mean, the last terrestrial service that I can think of would have been MVDDS, and that's not the most widely used of all services anymore. But I was surprised to see some momentum pick up and to start seeing studies emerge that would tend to vindicate the idea that there could be a possibility of coexistence. This is a tough question because obviously satellite terrestrial coexistence has always been fraught before, and there are heavy expectations on a number of 12 gigahertz satellite incumbents, including in some cases as recipients of RDOF money. So I would have to rely on the engineering record being, I guess, fully developed and a consensus emerging within the FCC before I could definitively sign on pro or con. But let's just stipulate for a second that the engineering assessment within the FCC does turn out to be favorable. At that point, I think there's significant potential. I mean, there are backhaul applications that I think people are thinking about a lot. Fixed wireless is one of these things where for a lot of people it's outside the traditional conception of broadband, which is wired broadband. And yet, if we're looking at the capacities of present-day fixed wireless, it far exceeds what would have been considered the terrestrial standard, the terrestrial wired standard, maybe just a decade back, even 5 years back. And if you look at the speeds that were being debated in connection, at the time of the Open Internet Order, well, the speeds that we're now funding federally are an order of magnitude higher, and fixed wireless can in some circumstances make those speeds, and is likely to continue developing. So anything that increases diversity in the technology sector and that therefore undermines monopolies and better serves the public, that's encouraging. Anything that permits unencumbered use that doesn't require coordination with, for example, very sophisticated radars, which creates second order problems because you also don't want to coordinate with those radars in a way that indirectly provides information about them. You get yourself out of a big can of worms, as you say, by going into a relatively free band in this respect. So I'm going to review the engineering record with great interest and continue to talk within the commission about it. But if we can get over the line in this area, then the benefits are obviously would be very substantial.
Well, we look forward to working with you and continuing our conversations. And we've enjoyed working with you from your first day till now on that issue. Talk a little bit, in this area of coordination, do you have any recommendations to avoid the issues that we just saw in the C-band with FAA and the 5G deployments? How do we have a better interagency communication coordination effort?
So I'm actually going to push that over to the question of technical standards just for a second before I talk about behavior within the government. So
I don't know which one is more difficult, standards or behavior in the government.
Sometimes standards of behavior in the government are the most difficult. So part of the difficulty is that if you look at current frequency allocations, they're by definition static. There's got to be a table of frequency allocations that everyone can rely on. And the problem is that incumbency tends to entrench those expectations at a time when our expectations across a wide variety of bands, certainly in mid-band, should be dynamic. And so there's the question always of when an agency behaves a certain way, what constituency is it protecting? And how did that constituency come to be in a position needing protection? My own view is that there are very frequently just no incentives to improve your receiver performance. There are just no incentives to do it. With present allocations, your receivers are good. And with changes, you can rely on the political process, and you can assert that there's harmful interference. Now, of course, under the Communications Act standard, to show harmful interference, you in part have to point to device performance. But the question then becomes, which device? Why is the standard for that device at that level? Are standards incommensurable between superficially similar devices? Now, I can think of services that operate on some kind of an exceptional basis for physics and engineering reasons. GPS immediately comes to mind because you're talking about multiple raw bit streams and not merely packets. And you need extremely high accuracy because of the relativistic effects that you rely on in order to get precision in calculating locations. But on the other hand, there are many services where a receiver is simply the industry standard because it's always been the industry standard and because it was expected that the TFA would stay static. And in that case, I'm not really sure what the regulatory lever the FCC has to change that would be at present, particularly if it's federally implicated spectrum. So we need to develop those tools, and that's a major thing that I'm going to be working on this year. As far as agency coordination, so I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth a little bit on this one because I'm in the unusual position of having been in the front office at the NTIA and then on the 8th floor at the FCC. The federal interests in spectrum are fundamentally different from commercial interests in that there's very often a mission-driven component to them that is just distinct from a commercial interest. And getting people to speak a common language can often be difficult. I mean, we've seen cases where the FCC said there was no harmful interference under our statute, and a federal agency comes back the next day and says there absolutely is harmful interference under the engineering standard to which we believe we're accountable in order to meet the obligations that we have under our statute. And so if people aren't talking a common language, then things will get resolved. I'm all for improvements in agency process and renewed MOUs and some approaches that have been proposed to allow to have Congress give the power, I should say, to the FCC to enforce greater decision finality in some cases. But ultimately, I think we'll get to a better place if we get to common standards for harmful interference before the fact. And then we're able to implement levers on those standards before the fact, before there's a confrontation. Because if we don't do that, we're going to wind up seeing incommensurable dual studies where each entity that commissions a study that halfway supports its position will take it back to its constituency and say, we have a study, it says the opposite of what the FCC says. It reminds me, a little bit of litigation. You've got dueling experts. How's the jury supposed to decide? In this case, the jury, Congress, and the American public. Without becoming professional spectrum engineers themselves, how are they supposed to decide? And the answer should be that the FCC has the final say and everyone else trusts us. I think the way to build the soft power to get there, in part, is to get everyone on the same page about what constitutes harmful interference, how we measure it, what standards both sides would accept. Get to what they call in science an adversarial collaboration, where you begin from a position of disagreement, but then work towards agreement on as many points as possible. Again, I think there's significant potential for an overall decrease in tension in the harmful interference assessment process if we consciously develop these tools now.
As I listen to you, it does give me a sense that you're uniquely positioned, having worked at NTIA and at the FCC, to help bridge the language divide, a common language, a common mission, common standards and principle. And so we need your leadership on that area, because it is very, very critical to have the ability to break through on these things because of the race to 5G and the national security implications, as well as international competitiveness, as well as closing the digital divide and getting connectivity to every American. And it seems arcane, and it seems very technical, and it seems very much of engineering, but as you laid it out, it just struck me as how important and significant that work is. So I wish you the very best and give you our members and our commitment to help in that. We have a history of, as you talked about, standards to protect incumbents, being the ones who try to change the standards so that we can have free and open competition. Which gets me to the last two questions. We have a major infusion of federal funding. The FCC is in charge of mapping before that funding can be delivered through the states to bring this new national commitment to reality, which is connectivity for every American at high speed, moving towards symmetrical to future-proofing. Give me your thoughts on the FCC's role and how this should be administered and executed, and anything that you can do in your role as commissioner. And then two, you have been very focused on the role of cybersecurity in our national well-being and security and economic growth. So talk about, one, the federal funding, the FCC role, and then close on cybersecurity.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, with federal funding, the infusion of over $40 billion in the program being bootstrapped right now is unprecedented in size, and and what's more, it's also unprecedented in its institutional commitments. Now, I love the NTIA, and I know that they're up to the job, but it's a big job, and we have to be realistic about what a demand is being placed on the agency. Consider they're going to have to deal with over 50 jurisdictions. I can imagine running a granting process for 50 jurisdictions without very, very significant thought at the state level about how to pitch, present, and prove that the proposal is good. So my own view right now is that every single state should be thinking really hard about developing the most coherent, detailed, geographically specific plan that they can, in order to put it before the NTIA and allow the NTIA to have a good interface with that state, so that they can make a thorough assessment. If the NTIA clears a state a day, it will take a whole year. So when you put it in those terms, creating an easily accessed interface for the NTIA with the state's plans, it'll be easier the more detailed the plans are. Fine, we don't need to drill down into the model of the individual router in the particular hospital, but the more detailed they are as to the infrastructure plans that they'll be implementing, the easier it will be for the NTIA to assess what they're doing. Of course, the NTIA has a great record on grant making, and I'm not saying that they would not in time get through everything and do a great job on it, but at least at the time I was there, the NTIA was about 250 people, of whom 60 or 70 were the research lab staff out in Colorado. So as a grant-making body, we've really given them a significant amount of work to do, and I think states are going to have to be very smart, very proactive too. I also think probably the first few states out of the gate are going to implicitly set the standard for everyone else. So just by defining the context in which review takes place.
So first to move is important.
I think it's very important. I think state governments have to be thinking about their unique geographic situations, the unique needs of their populations, their rural development plans right now. Just to pick a few geographic examples, West Virginia is challenging terrain for fiber in some areas because you've got extremely dense mountain, and you've got pervasive settlement sometimes in valleys, and so drilling there can be a challenge. And so there's the West Virginia government, and I'm sure they've thought about this in immense detail, is going to have to decide whether wireless or fiber is the best approach. And that's a tough question, because you have to look at the carrying cost over time. You have to look at what the upgrade potential is for each technology. I wouldn't presume to step into their shoes to make this decision. Or if you look at Florida, Florida has unique challenges as far as fiber because the coral sand is hard on drills. And I personally know some people in the drilling business who live in Florida but tend not to work there because it's so hard on their equipment, which is not something that I would have ever realized any other way. If you look at population settlement patterns in highly rural states, in some cases, Alaska comes to mind. There tends to be a relatively dense village model that is often served by a fiber trunk that then branches out from a central location. On the other hand, in a Midwestern farming community that might have the overall similar population density, the people might be more geographically dispersed, and what's more, individual subscribers might be more interested in fixed wireless because they need connectivity throughout their entire operation, such as, for example, a milk barn or a feedlot. So just with me spending 5 minutes running through examples here, my mind is already starting to boggle. I'm starting to ask myself how I would possibly assess all these things. So I think the deeper that states think about this and the more specific they get, the better cases they'll make. And at the same time, yeah, I think whoever defines the program is going to be much more impactful than the last to file.
And well, as everybody in the audience can tell, you have thought about these things in detail and all the different models. And so your suggestions and encouragement, and our encouragement to the states is develop your plans, develop your maps, get your programs, work concurrently with NTIA. Our members located, whether it's in Maine or Mississippi, need to be shaping what their states are doing and urging them to move as quickly as possible. Because if they're the last to move, the last to adopt, they'll continue to be last in the market and in the opportunities that broadband brings. So we appreciate your message. Cybersecurity, one last thing, and I know it's near and dear to what you think is important for the future.
I'm very fortunate in that I was able to hire a former security engineer from one of your member companies as my technology advisor. So Marco, wave. So I've had the benefit of great cybersecurity advice for some time. Now, thinking about the role of cybersecurity at the FCC is also difficult, though, because the FCC, I don't view it as having a broad mandate for cybersecurity as a whole. I mean, certainly, again, we don't see DHS coming to us and asking us for cybersecurity standards, and and no wonder, because we're not an IT agency, we're a telecommunications agency, which is a very different thing. However, that's not to say that none of what we do touches on cybersecurity. For one thing, we fund a lot of equipment, and it behooves us to talk about what the security standards should be for that equipment. But more generally,
Huawei is an example.
Huawei is an example. We fund equipment in schools, obviously. We fund a lot of equipment in various communities. And while Huawei and ZTE funding is an issue that came directly to us from Congress, and that we, of course, duly carry out, I think there's also deeper thinking that we can do on this issue, because I'm not sure that the national provenance of a device is sufficient. Devices are interconnected. You might have a device that is fully safe throughout its entire supply chain, that's been manufactured entirely onshore. I don't know that there are that many, but let's stipulate that there are. that device is still going to be on a network that is subject to attack in some cases by very unexpected sources. I've spoken to a professor at Virginia Tech who told me that he has his students build Stingray capable equipment out of off-the-shelf parts that you can buy for under $100. I've spoken to people who are who've made me aware of some of the extremely high quality pineapples for sale on Amazon. Not to single out Amazon. I mean, if not Amazon, you get it on Alibaba. But the point is that the cheap, complex devices are out there, and they're part of our modern wireless world in a way that they just never were prior. And it's sort of reminding me of the late 90s when we started to see everyone get online, and there were security tools a mile wide in every browser. Everyone was connecting over plain vanilla HTTP instead of HTTPS. People were using logon admin, password admin, and some, people who weren't even all that technical, nonetheless got hold of exploits and the necessary knowledge and technology to use them. And it was just sort of the Wild West for a very long time. And I think it's important to just go back and read the news from the late 90s and realize how crazy it would have seemed that we can, now buy products with a few clicks, trusting that our data is generally safe. Now, when a company accidentally exposes credit card numbers, that's a national scandal instead of just being Tuesday. So we've worked hard to close all those gaps. But I view that as being analogous to today's situation with wireless technology. Cheap, complex devices have proliferated at the very time that we're becoming much, much more dependent on highly densified spectrum, implying high device densification. I mean, that's part of the pitch for 5G, right? That you can put so many more devices in a square mile. Many of those devices will perform infrastructure functions. Many of them will run at very low power, meaning that they don't even need to be serviced for a long time. But the other side of that is that vulnerabilities may become baked in if there's no firmware cycle upgrade, if there's no mandatory response to a security breach of a given magnitude, if we haven't thought about what the checklists are for preventing signal attacks and making that part of the device licensing process. Finally, just to point to a few examples, it's well known that GPS jamming is not that hard to do. In fact, sometimes happens inadvertently. I'm not saying that we should prevent people from selling jamming capable equipment, but maybe giving some sort of a look into local law enforcement for enforcement powers in this area would be interesting. This isn't exactly cybersecurity, but it's not exactly not either. Likewise, we've seen attacks. We've seen attacks via flaws in or continuities between one version of a wireless protocol and the next versus the hardware that was built with the expectation it was going to run the former and not the latter. And sometimes it can be, I've got one specific case study on my desk where the injection was, on the order of 37 bytes, and yet that was enough to compromise eventually the entire Wi-Fi router against the corporate system. Or likewise, another thing that we could do as part of the authorization process, and we want to talk very closely with your membership about this, but talk about ways to get researchers more access to the raw frames so that on wireless devices, so that they can start performing their own security audits, and we don't effectively have the security audits taking place at the level of cyber criminals and state actors. And maybe if we can find out a secure, traceable process that vendors and standards bodies can respect in getting there, maybe we can pinch that off and get our own researchers a leg up.
Well, as I listen to you, I want to commend you for finding the unique, distinct, individual role and responsibilities that you can play in a very constructive way at the FCC. And all of our members look forward to working with you going forward as you carve your niches and your leadership at the commission. So thank you.